education, also known as FAPE, should or should not include mandatory ABA services for children and youth with autism spectrum disorders in the public school setting. My name is Pedro Morales, and I will be the moderator, and I will also briefly introduce 6 topics that will be discussed throughout the debate. Brief backgrounds about our team members are that I'm a middle school teacher and behavior assistant in South Florida. On the pro side, we have Kristen, who's a special education teacher in Indiana, and Lauren, who's an RBT that provides in-home therapy in Maryland. On the con side, we have Colleen, who's an ABA director and owner in North Idaho, and Aaron, who's a 3rd grade teacher in the Chicago area. It is important to note that the mandate included in the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act in 1975 provided children with disabilities access to FAPE. It established a system equipped with specialized instructional methods and techniques that supported the individual needs of the special education population. However, many special education teachers and schools have not been required to implement ABA strategies per their state's Department of Education. Therefore, many parents have been advocating and fighting for their children to receive this effective treatment. There are other evidence-based behavioral interventions which will be discussed during the debate. You will hear viewpoints from both sides on this issue, along with current literature and research to support their claims as to why ABA should or should not be mandated in public schools. The debaters will also address the BACD professional and ethical compliance codes relevancy as they align it with their specific viewpoints. The debate will include the following topics being addressed by both pro and con debaters. They include 1. The theoretical and practical issues relevant to special education. 2. Pros and cons of special education services. 3. Laws and relevant litigation which provide historical context. 4. Ethical dilemmas facing special education and other professionals serving students with ASD. 5. Results from the research literature on ABA and alternative instructional methods. And lastly, 6. The potential role BCBAs play as collaborative partners and what their duties are. We will begin the debate with addressing the issue of the theoretical and practical issues relevant to special education. We turn to the pro side first to hear the opening statement. Kristen, the pro stater, what is your take on this? And then to Erin, the co-stater, to hear her rebuttal.
As we start to analyze this topic, we will first look at the importance of this issue according to the prevalence of autism. According to the data collected by the Center for Disease Control, the prevalence of individuals with autism has increased over the past few years. In 2000, the prevalence of individuals diagnosed with autism was approximately 1 for every 150 children. In 2004, the prevalence increased to every 1 in 125 children. In 2006, it increased again to every 1 in 110 children. In 2008, the prevalence was approximately 1 in every 88 children. And then finally, in 2010 and 2012, the prevalence of children diagnosed with autism was reported at 1 in every 68 children. Overall, this data shows that the prevalence of individuals diagnosed with autism from 2000 to 2012 has almost doubled. There are various factors that are believed to contribute to this increase in individuals diagnosed with autism. However, this information shows the need for appropriate supports for these individuals in schools. As of 2012, 1.5 million children were diagnosed with autism. Later, we will discuss how educating students with autism is a responsibility of the schools as a part of the legislation, the Free and Appropriate Public Education.
For the con side of this topic, we focused on 2 articles that we found. The first one was written by a BCBAD, and she expressed her concerns within the ABA field. She stated that treatments for children with autism spectrum disorders are overly focused on ABA therapy, and programs may be including ABA, but without considering input from other educational professionals. She also focused on sections of IDEA in that article, which were supportive to our side too. ABA therapy is just one methodology used to address the needs of children with autism spectrum disorder, and she cautioned that services should be made based on the unique needs of each individual child with a disability. In the second article that we found to support this topic, there was a survey conducted to determine possible barriers that prevented the adoption of ABA-based treatments in public schools, and 46 states responded, and the results were determined that there was a shortage of educational staff experienced in working with the special student population. There was a lack of agreement among professionals about the most appropriate intervention methods, and there was a lack of funding for professional development and technical assistance to school districts. If there is a lack of funding now, where will money come from to adopt ABA principles in the schools in the future? No matter how effective research shows a program is, it cannot be effective in a school unless it is adopted and implemented at the classroom level, and teachers don't have the capacity to do this with the current lack of training. ABA principles were determined to be needed in schools 2 decades ago, and that hasn't come to fruition yet, and the barrier to adoption still exists. Education literature suggests that as many as half of all schools into which innovative, evidence-based programs are introduced fail to implement them, and there are also concerns with costs to implement ABA interventions.
For the pro side, we evaluated a study focused on teacher perspective of causation of behavior. The schools of thought that were analyzed were biophysical, which was genetic, hereditary, and biochemical factors that affect behavior; developmental, behavior as a result of certain stages of development; psychodynamic, behavior is based on inner thoughts; and behavioral, behavior is controlled by antecedents and consequences. As you can see in the slide, the study conducted gave participants a questionnaire at the beginning of the study to collect information on the perceived explanations for behavior in a school setting. Before the implementation of the study in service, the educators that participated in this study believed that behavior was caused by factors other than the behavioral explanation. The developmental explanation was the highest ranking perspective prior to the training. Subsequently, teachers went through training based on classroom management through the perspective of applied behavior analysis. After participants went through training, they completed another questionnaire that analyzed if their perspective on the behavior had changed after training. After training, participants agreed the most with the behavioral explanation. These study results show that teachers and schools need to be informed and aware of the applied behavior analysis perspective of behavior. In schools, consultants need to be aware that teachers and other school personnel may not be analyzing behavior through the behavioral perspective. This study also concluded that through proper training on behavior management through the implementation of ABA, it can change the teacher's perspective on student behavior from other explanations of behavior to a behavioral approach. The implementation of ABA has been proven effective in changing behavior through environmental manipulations and behavior management strategies.
For our statement on the con side, according to a website regarding the pros and cons of inclusion, in order for schools to move towards a more inclusive approach, it isn't as simple as providing staff with behavioral training or having consultants available when needed. It's going to require a complete overhaul of the public school system, and the restructuring efforts are going to be challenging, time-consuming, and expensive. According to a website regarding funding, educating special education students costs twice as much as general education students. Therefore, implementing ABA correctly in the schools will increase dramatically. According to a study conducted through 2014, schools spent twice as much as they had projected. And as indicated by the graph attached, you can see where IDEA has appropriations set at 40% of what the actual estimated costs were to fully fund the IDEA. And looking at the next slide at the estimated cost for ABA therapy, it costs more than $40,000 per year for BCBAs on average, with some charging up to $120 an hour in some areas. As you can see, the average cost of a special education paraprofessional nationwide is about $12 per hour on average versus the cost of a BCBA, which is an average of $40 per hour.
One of the con statements is that there's a shortage of educational staff experienced in working with special student populations. This shows the need for BCBAs and other trained staff in applied behavior analysis to implement and carry out behavior programs for individuals with autism. Another con statement was the lack of agreement among professionals about the most appropriate intervention methods. While there is disagreement or different perspectives from different professionals in schools, our studies show another important role BCBA can play in schools. BCBA can train school staff on the importance of behavioral school of thought, where behavior is controlled by antecedents and consequences. Another con statement is the lack of funding for professional development and technical assistance to school districts. Is there a lack of funding? If there is a lack of funding now, where will money come from to adopt ABA principles in the schools in the future? While there is a shortage in funding in schools, if a BCBA is hired, he or she can help in multiple ways. Not only can a BCBA perform behavior analysis and create behavioral programs, They can also teach and inform school staff in the methods of behavior analysis.
In an article regarding positive behavior supports in ABA, positive behavior supports have been associated with a great deal of federal funding and has been written into policy at the federal level, showing that ABA isn't the only evidence-based practice determined to be effective in the schools. IDEA maintains provisions for positive behavioral interventions and supports for children with disabilities who display problem behavior. And positive behavior supports became popular because educators and parents informed policymakers that positive behavior supports was having an important impact on their children's lives. Practitioners of positive behavior supports apply basic behavioral principles to solve human problems, and they produce meaningful and durable outcomes. So many professionals and paraprofessionals use principles of behavior, but they're not familiar with the conceptual and empirical basis of ABA, and they're still successful in implementing it.
Overall, for the pro side on this topic, in all, it is important to recognize the growing need in schools to meet the needs of students with autism. These students have more than academic needs. They need support with social skills, communication, and most of all, behavior to learn to their full potential.
For the con side, there is a financial toll on taxpayers when public schools fail to adopt ABA-based interventions for their students with autism spectrum disorders, and this cannot be ignored. Under IDEA, these children receive free and appropriate public education that allows them to learn as much as possible. However, when public schools do not use interventions with proven efficacy, courts can mandate costly private school alternatives. This can be pricey. The estimated cost of educating a student with autism in a private placement can range from $22,500 to over $75,000 per year, with an expected course from 2 to 6 years.
Those are all excellent points. Moving on to the next topic. What are your takes on the pros and cons sides of special education services? This includes eligibility criteria, services, supports, and outcomes of children and youth with ASD. We will begin with Kristen's statement and then hear Aaron's position on this topic.
As we start with the pro side, it is important to look that each state has their own legislation for special education. We will look specifically at the Indiana Special Education Law, known as Article 7. As you can see on the next slide here, there are 13 different eligibility categories for students in Indiana. It is important to note that in order for an individual to be eligible for special education services, the disability needs to adversely affect the student's education. However, eligibility categories that can relate to individuals with autism include developmental delay, and this is applicable when children are younger, between the ages of 3 and 5. Additionally, they can qualify under the autism spectrum disorder, a cognitive disability, and/or a speech or language impairment. Special education services are listed on the student's IEP. A student needs to be placed in the least restrictive environment. This means that, to the maximum extent possible, students should be educated with non-disabled students. On the next slide here, there is a continuum of placement options. First, the student can be placed where services are provided in the general education classroom. Then, there are also services provided in a resource room. Then there's also the separate classroom, a separate non-residential school or facility, a residential school or facility, or a homebound or hospital setting.
For the con side for this topic, we found a couple different articles, and they discussed the revision of the IDEA in 2004 and required behavioral supports for students in the classroom. But opponents of ABA often attack the use of sequenced, structured instruction as compromising the intellectual development of the learner. Oppositional statements include claiming that teachers do not need database findings to decide how to teach the children in their classroom.
From the pro side, we evaluate research about outcomes using ABA. One article that we reviewed was that talked about how ABA was utilized successfully in a school in the UK, and it was specifically an ASD school. Another article we evaluated was showed us that the lack of behavioral knowledge creates the outcome of teachers managing behaviors inappropriately. Looking back at the Indiana Special Education Article 7, we note that there are related services for children with ASD. These include transportation, corrective, and other supportive services needed for the students to benefit from special education services. To name a few, there are audiological services, counseling services, early identification and assessment of disabilities in children, occupational therapy, physical therapy, psychological services, and transportation.
For the con side, we evaluated an article by Barry Prezant talking about is ABA the only way? And he discussed some definitions of ABA and how they vary, as do practices that fall under the heading of ABA. An ABA researcher recently stated that ABA and its practices have changed drastically over the past 30 years, and it now varies from traditional practices to contemporary practices. Traditional ABA practice is highly structured, it's fast-paced and adult-directed, for example, discrete trial training. The implementation requires precise teaching and oversight by professionals. So we ask, do schools have the capacity to employ BCBAs continuously and ensure reliability checks that ABA is being implemented with fidelity? We all know that traditional ABA uses one-on-one instruction, so are schools equipped to staff children that need those one-on-one supports? Some modern researchers of behaviorism have criticized ABA approaches that use the adult-directed teaching as the go-to intervention, stating that the effectiveness can be limiting. Some of the most well-respected and highly published researchers in ABA and ASD over the past 3 decades have been openly critical of traditional ABA practices. And researchers are now employing naturalistic approaches that have been proven effective in meeting the developmental milestones and the necessary social skills. School paraprofessionals should have the capacity to learn these more naturalistic approaches without the expense of a BCBA.
One con statement is that the teachers do not need data-based findings to decide how to teach children. While teachers may not think they do need data-based information to teach children, it is important to utilize these strategies to improve student behavior. While punishment is typically used in schools today, there are more effective interventions that behavior analysts can show teachers to improve student behavior. When student behavior is addressed with the assistance of a behavior analyst, the teacher can implement his or her expertise in the academic areas instead of in order to teach the student. That I wanted to bring up was also stated earlier, the prevalence of ASD has increased over the past years. In 2000, it was 1 in every 150, and in 2012, it was 1 in every 68. So the services offered in schools should meet the deficits of individuals with ASD, including the increasing number of those individuals. They can include speech and language, OT, and behavior management. The study conducted and explained in this article examines how there were lower rates of behavior management services, which is inconsistent with the social and behavioral impairments of individuals with ASD. Behavior services are an unmet need in schools, and the need to provide effective and quality behavior programs such as ABA that are implemented by BCBAs who are specially trained in this area is high. Another article discussed the need for training staff members, but without BCBAs, the training can only go so far.
The pro side mentioned that other professionals should be involved in the education of special ed students, and we fully agree, and we think that these particular professionals should be utilized before hiring BCBAs in the schools. Examples of these types of professionals include behavior specialists, social workers, psychologists, special education teachers, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and support groups. All of these can be utilized before hiring a BCBA to work with those children.
So overall, for the pro side, we believe that the law has several supports in place for students who are diagnosed with various disabilities. In schools, students with autism are eligible for special education services if their disability affects their education. Individuals with autism can portray deficits in the areas of academics, social and communication skills, motor skills, and behavior management. The state law lists supports and services for all of these areas of need except for behavior. It is important to service students with highly qualified personnel in all areas of need, including behavior. Therefore, behavior analysts, such as BCBAs, play an important role to create behavior programs and implement behavior analysis for students with these needs.
To wrap up this topic for the con side, we just want to reiterate that while there are supports in place to help those diagnosed with various disabilities, the rigid structure of those supports could cause more harm rather than help. Also, contemporary and traditional ABA methods are often adult-directed and focus on one-on-one interventions, and studies have showed limited effectiveness in these.
We will now hear about the laws and relevant litigation which provide historical context. Debaters, be sure to compare and contrast demographics, key issues, legal proceedings, arguments, and judgments. Kristen and Aaron, what are your takes on this?
As we start this aspect from the pro side, looking at this presentation, we can see that there are various laws and litigation to consider when providing services to individuals with autism in schools. There are various legislations, such as the Education for All Handicapped Children, which was signed into law in 1975. There's also the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, known as IDEA, which supports children with disabilities to attend public schools. The Free and Appropriate Public Education, known as FAPE, states that students receive appropriate services and supports through public schools, no matter their disability and needs. These laws explain that evidence-based practices need to be implemented in schools. The progress of students with special needs are monitored based on data collected through their Individualized Education Plan, known as the IEP. There's also the Public Law 94-142, which states that services for individuals with disabilities should move away from clinical settings and move more towards school-based and home-based services.
For this topic, for the con side, we found two different articles that had relevance. The first one is focused on the fact that the law does not specifically state the need to utilize ABA in schools and that other practices and interventions can be utilized. And the other one highlighted cost differentials, basically focused on various ethnicities. Laws are put into place in order to service children of all abilities, so why isn't funding the same across ethnicities for these services?
There are ethical and legal factors to consider for general education placement issues for special education placement and services. There are academic and non-academic benefits to the student, including social and peer models. The effect of the student's behavior on classmates. Does the student's behavior impair the learning of classmates? And if so, you need to demonstrate this impairment. The student's effect on the teacher. You need to take reasonable steps to reduce the burden on the teacher with having a student with special needs in the classroom. Aids in service does not mean that expensive programs are not appropriate, such as ABA. And IDEA specifically provides funds to educate students with special needs, which would be supplemental aids and services. Requires adequate supplementary aids and services. If a child's progress is minimum, they may not be receiving appropriate services, accommodations, and/or support. In this case, the school may be failing to provide appropriate education for the student. So you also need to consider that the student should be placed in the general education classroom. However, if this is not considered, the school has also violated IDEA and the goal to mainstream students with disabilities. The Individualized Education Program, IEP, you need to consider all variables to make each student successful in school, and FAPE requires that each student be given the opportunity to be successful and make progress in school. The least restrictive environment is also important, which also includes that the least intrusive interventions must be implemented before more intrusive interventions are considered, including punishment. So there are a lot of ethical and legal issues, one being the use of punishment. From the perspective of behavior analysis, punishment is when a stimulus is added to decrease the future occurrence of a behavior. There's a lot of controversy with the implementation of punishment to stop inappropriate behaviors, and it should only be considered as a last resort after all other reinforcement interventions have been implemented without success. Another thing to evaluate is behavior measurement. Student behavior must be assessed before interventions are implemented. When behavior change programs are implemented, data on student behavior should continually be recorded. This allows behavior analysts to analyze the data to determine the effectiveness of a program. If data shows an intervention is not changing behavior, it is necessary to implement different interventions. According to IDEA, it is not ethical to continue a behavior change program when there is not significant improvement in behavior. Another article that we looked at stated that the state departments are now requiring staff to be using ABA methods, including but not limited to functional behavior assessments, positive behavioral supports, behavioral interventions, and classroom and student management. Consistent special education laws for all states is important and would be very helpful.
In support of the con side, again, as we've previously stated, the use of paraprofessionals is effective. They are trainable and the cost savings is necessary. IDEA requires least restrictive environment, and having group support versus one-on-one is typically seen as least restrictive, and paraprofessionals are an effective way to achieve that. It would be a feasible goal to ensure that special education teachers gain the necessary skills in their education and in their continuing education to train paraprofessionals to support children with ASD with evidence-based practices that are effective.
One con statement is that the law does not explicitly state ABA services. ABA is a good interpretation of the law as it does not explicitly say anything. ABA is an all-encompassing practice. Another con statement is that money is not distributed evenly. If there was enough funding, the funds could be distributed easier.
In support of the con side, one of the pro statements was that the IDEA is designed to help those with disabilities, and IDEA has not been updated since 2004. So since 2004, numbers have gone from 1 in 125 to 1 in 68 currently. And since the rates of autism diagnoses have doubled in the last 12 years, changes need to be made to IDEA to make interventions more accessible to the growing number of families.
Based on information we found in an article that focuses on the No Child Left Behind Act, it describes various laws for individuals with disabilities in schools. The article describes the importance of No Child Left Behind Act, implementing evidence-based practices, and services and instruction provided by highly qualified teachers or professionals. Although there may be some barriers with funding, the law needs to be followed. Schools need to implement evidence-based practices to service and support all students, including those with autism. A barrier students with autism face is behavior management. Applied behavior analysis is an evidence-based practice to improve behavior, especially in individuals with autism. These interventions and supports need to be implemented and led by a highly qualified individual, such as a BCBA.
To close out this topic for the con side, we just want to reiterate that all funding should be the same for everyone, which is still an issue that we're seeing, and that other interventions besides ABA could be utilized to help these children.
The next topic we will address are the ethical dilemmas facing special education and other professionals serving students with ASD. What are your positions on this topic?
As we start with the pro side, there are various ethical dilemmas that need to be resolved when working with individuals with autism in schools. As Lauren previously mentioned, punishment procedures are unethical behavior procedures. However, several schools implemented consequential interventions, such as implementing punishment after a behavior has occurred. These practices are contrary to the Ethical Code of Conduct, which states that reinforcement strategies and interventions should be implemented first. Only after intervention strategies do not change behavior should punishment procedures be utilized. When punishment procedures are implemented, the student should also be taught an appropriate replacement behavior at the same time. A behavior analyst, such as a BCBA, can help schools in these situations to set up appropriate procedures in schools and show the importance of antecedent and reinforcement procedures. A behavior analyst is responsible to uphold the professional and ethical compliance codes created by the BACB. These codes focus on the ethical responsibilities of a behavior analyst.
Through the research on the con side, we found that the field of autism can be plagued with fad treatments that are ineffective, pseudoscientific, and anti-scientific. These types of interventions have a hard time following the ethical guidelines that are in place. And a lot of the time, evidence is based on parent, authority figure, and professional societal testimony, which goes against the ethical code that's in place right now. 3 basic components of treatment that must be addressed are the theoretical basis and assumptions of treatment, treatment techniques used, and the treatment claims used to analyze these things. Issues with all three areas result in it not being a proper intervention for students.
The pro side would now like to bring up the ethical compliance codes. There is growing support for ABA in the classroom. The proof lies in the ethics codes for BCBAs that they are competent and qualified to provide the best service available. Per ethics codes 1 through 4, BCBAs rely on the use of evidence-based treatments, have excellent boundaries and responsibility, know the rights and work with the prerogatives on their clients, and their work is behavioral in nature while ensuring least restrictive environments and avoiding harm. Therefore, for the cost of implementing ABA in the schools, BCBAs are already trained in all areas.
In support of the con side, based on an article regarding doing no harm, ABA services are provided to individuals. The individual, their family, and the behavior analyst enter a relationship that carries with it a large amount of responsibilities on part of the behavior analyst. These responsibilities are in relation to a code of ethical practices. However, they are not black and white or derived from science. Therefore, the gray areas of ethics will always exist, and harm can and will be done in some cases. The ethical compliance codes are known to lack in areas, and there will inevitably be cases where situations don't have a black and white answer. Also, just because someone was awarded their board certification does not ensure that they will adhere to them in the gray zone situations. No explicit consequences are actually identified in the ethics code when a violation might occur. Therefore, there's a need for black and white guidelines for BCBAs.
One con statement is that the field of autism can be plagued with bad treatments. While there are bad treatments in society today that state they help individuals with autism, it is important to promote and implement evidence-based practices. ABA is a practice that has been tested and proven. Research shows effective interventions that can be implemented with individuals with autism to improve behavior. Another con statement is that there are difficulties following the ethical guidelines. When there is a highly qualified individual in schools, he or she can help the school follow ethical guidelines. Part of a BCBA's job is to make sure all practices, interventions, and interactions follow the ethical guidelines put in place by the BACB. The professional and ethical compliance codes for behavior analysts were written specifically to assure the appropriate and ethical behavior for behavior analysts when working with clients, including students in schools.
In support of the con side again, according to the National Standards Project Phase 2, modeling, natural teaching strategies, pivotal response training, and the use of schedules and story-based interventions are all considered established interventions. All of these could easily be taught by a special education teacher and supported by a paraprofessional.
Overall, for the pro side on this aspect, in schools, teachers and staff need to be trained appropriately. BCBAs can support and guide staff members who work with students with ASD. BCBAs can overlook and monitor behavior programs as they are implemented. These professionals can make appropriate changes and train others as necessary. It is important to make sure evidence-based and appropriate interventions are implemented, such as reinforcement and antecedent interventions are utilized before considering punishment procedures. Not only does a BCBA create and implement behavior change programs, but they also uphold and abide by the professional and ethical compliance codes for behavior analysts.
To close for the con side, we want to remind everyone that the world of autism can result in fad treatments that do not lead to success. We want to be sure that that does not happen with public schools. And also the ethical compliance codes lack in areas that need to be addressed prior to BCBAs being implemented in public schools.
We will now hear about the results from the research literature on ABA and the alternative instructional methods that can be provided to students and youth with ASD. Kristen, we begin with you.
To start off with the pro side, looking at research articles, legislation, and methods to work with individuals with autism, we found inconsistencies in certain aspects of services for students with disabilities. Looking at state legislation for special education eligibility areas, there needs to be a consistent criteria for all states. Currently, each state has different legislation and laws for special education. There are different eligibility criteria for disabilities, and this can be difficult in various areas, especially when students move schools or to different states. In regards to issues with related services and special education services, there are fields such as OT and PT that have consistent parameters for eligibility. Therefore, there are no complications if a child moves to another state. In the field of behavior management, ABA is an evidence-based practice. We suggest that it should become a related service in order to keep consistency if a child were to move. Moreover, it should become a standard of behavior management in schools.
The Conside has focused this whole debate on the fact that ABA is not the only answer. And in this section, we'll focus on various other methods, which include the Sunrise program that was developed by a man who was diagnosed with autism at a young age who shows no signs of his disability today.
One of the main goals that the ProSide really wants to happen is the consistent definition for disability areas. We wanted to mention the developmental delayed term that some kids are given, and this definition varies across states. In Indiana, they are only eligible for that code from age 3 to 5, and they need a different label when entering kindergarten. But in Kentucky, they're eligible for developmental delay from age 3 to 8. It's difficult to change the label if a student moves from state to state and receive appropriate services, so there needs to be consistent eligibility categories and criteria. In one article, it discussed that ABA is individualized and evidence-based. Some of the interventions are ABA, which is utilized since the 1960s. There are other models of this, which include TEA, CCH, or TEACH, and the SCIRTS model. But these models have issues, such as the inability to be utilized with other methods, or the fact that they only focus on parts of the child instead of the whole. ABA is implemented by highly qualified individuals and encompasses the whole child and gives the ability to utilize them with other methods. Some compliance codes that are specifically relevant in this area are Code 1.01, the reliance on scientific knowledge and evidence-based practices, and Compliance Code 4.03, the Individualized Behavior Change Programs that are not a blanket intervention and are highly specific to each child.
In regards to the Conside, you just heard Erin speak about the Sunrise program, and according to information and testimonials from parents regarding that Sunrise program, it's another example of an effective treatment for ASD that doesn't use principles of ABA. So instead of stopping repetitive behaviors, parents join in on the behaviors, showing that they're interested in their children, since the behaviors are obviously important to that child, and they serve as an automatic reinforcer. So the mindset is that once a child sees that their parent is accepting of them and their behaviors, the door opens for learning opportunities. The program uses individual interests and it incorporates them into therapy, so the child wants to come back for more, and it has that natural built-in reinforcement. So what they're finding is that children in this program begin relating in a much more natural way, opposed to a rote or robotic way that many kids do under discrete trial training or other one-on-one adult-directed methodologies.
The con statement from this part of the debate is that ABA is not the only answer. ABA is an evidence-based intervention that can be used in a variety of settings. It should not be the only service offered, but it should be offered.
The ProSide had a statement that said all states need to have consistency when it comes to eligibility, but the Conside is wondering how can all states be consistent when they have different populations and numbers of BCBAs? Who will be responsible for determining what the eligibility is across America, and who will fund this?
So overall for the ProSide on this area, ABA could be best utilized in schools through consistency of law and consistency of use in the classroom. By making ABA consistent service across schools and states, this abides by the laws, IGA, and the No Child Left Behind Act, and the ethical compliance codes for behavior analysts.
To wrap it up for the Conside on this topic, ABA is not the only answer to provide treatment for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Other programs, including specifically the Sunrise program, can be used in order to reach clients in a different way.
The last imperative topic that will be discussed is the potential role BCBAs play as collaborative partners and what their duties are. Kristen, we begin with you.
To start off with the ProSide, BCBAs can serve as individuals who lead collaboration with other professionals when serving students in schools. In support of BCBAs in schools, we will look at the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. To begin, in Code 2.0, it states, a behavior analyst will work with all parties involved, will keep all individuals involved and informed, and a behavior analyst is trained to communicate clearly and resolve conflicts. Even when working with various parties, a behavior analyst will advocate for and put the care and best interest of the client first. And the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code 3.0 is also important in outlining the duties of a BCBA to implement individualized behavior programs.
For this section for the con side, we'll be focusing on a presentation that discusses the problems in areas where there are not enough BCBAs. This information was retrieved from the BACB website, and these figures were from the Find BCBA page under the certificate registry. It appears as though some names on the registry were duplicated. However, this gives a rough idea of how many BCABA, BCBA, and BCBADs there are in the United States and other territories. We will look at this information more closely on the following graph. You can see on this graph that this is the BCBAs per state. This is the overall graph of the BCABAs, BCBAs, and BCBADs per state. You notice the state with the most BCBAs is California. To be specific, it has 3,779 BCABAs, BCBAs, and BCBADs. The states with the fewest BCBAs are Wyoming with only 7, Puerto Rico with 8, North Dakota with 18, and Idaho with 21. There's also a list of states with fewer than 50 BCBAs within the entire state or territory, and these include Wyoming, Puerto Rico, North Dakota, Idaho, South Dakota, Delaware, Montana, Alaska, Washington, D.C., New Mexico, and Mississippi.
The pro side would like to point out that the BCBA has a large role in assessing behavior. We look to Ethical Code 3.0, which targets assessing behavior and collecting data and conducting assessments to create individualized programs, which they then must explain those results in a way that other people can understand. And according to Ethical Code 4.0, you also need to involve clients in planning and get their consent. That discussed ABA and PBS. According to the text, it is important to use ABA when considering PBS in order for ABA to get a foot in the door to schools. This would not only strengthen the research and efficacy of PBS, but it would ensure it is used correctly and it has no reason to be separate.
In support of the con side, according to a text regarding ethical guidelines in ABA, research has suggested that not all BCBAs use ABA within their own practice, and not using scientifically validated interventions is itself a violation of the Ethics Code 1.01. It is a fact that implementation of ABAs in the schools under the provision of a BCBA will be really difficult in rural communities. So many questions arise, such as if a BCBA implements an ABA protocol in a school system and they're the only BCBA in that area, if they have an emergency or they have to leave, who's responsible to continue implementation for their student? Another question might be, when BCBAs implement programs according to the BACB Ethics Code, what happens when the school staff who are trained to carry out those interventions don't carry them out correctly? Guidelines are clear regarding BCBAs seeking higher levels of supervision when they're working with a child whose behaviors are out of their scope of practice. So again, what happens in a rural community when there is no other BCBA? And what's the responsibility to the student in the school? Another concern the con side is focusing on is the topic of caseload. So although there's no definite guideline regarding caseload sizes, the level of involvement required of the BCBA in standards 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and 5.0 implies limited number of caseloads. In regard to rural areas, where there might be one BCBA serving a vast area of rural communities, the standards seem to conflict with realities of the field. And our last point is in regard to lack of quality supervision. So there's an ethical responsibility that BCBAs have to their supervisees, and that's in Standard 5.0. It is common that students are placed under the direct supervision and care of frontline staff or paraprofessionals who are lacking pivotal skills that would enable them to understand and deliver behavior analytic programming. And it's a serious violation of the BCBA's ethical duties to delegate program implementation to people who are not capable of performing the job. And then our last question, what happens when a trained paraprofessional or a special education professional is sick? So the use of short-term or long-term substitutes happens, but it surely creates inconsistencies for students, as most likely the subs have no relevant experience and did not receive the ABA-based training from the BCBA.
One con statement is that BCBAs per state differ. Looking at the number of BCBAs per state, it is also important to compare these numbers to the population of each state. With recognizing the need for BCBAs in school, the BACB could create another set of guidelines for BCBAs who work in school. It is a growing profession when individuals learn that there is a need for behavior analysts in school. And with supply and demand, they are going to react to it, and there will be an increase in BCBAs. Another con statement is that there's a large caseload and instances of absences. The Ethical Compliance Code states that a BCBA should only accept clients he or she has the capability to provide appropriate services to, according to Compliance Code 2.01. And when a BCBA experiences unplanned interruptions for services, such as illnesses, family needs, or other situations, the BCBA should make efforts to service so that services are continued, according to Compliance Code 2.15. The BCBA could have prior connections with another behavior analyst who could take over in an event that the BCBA cannot carry out services for such reasons. This would allow the BCBA to be in the best interest of the client.
In regards to the concerns of BCBAs being absent, our side just wants to highlight that while it's easier for school districts to find certified substitutes for teachers, it could be very difficult to find subs for the BCBAs. Although BCBAs have relationships with others, and the pro side stated that services can be carried out by those people, with security restrictions by the way they are with schools today, they're not going to just let any BCBA substitute into the building in order to carry out those services without background checks and paperwork and other items that will cost more money and extra time.
So overall, on this subject for the pro side, it is important to note that a behavior analyst follows the compliance code for ethical conduct. It is their responsibility to implement the most effective intervention. BCBAs implement scientific and evidence-based interventions to improve behavior. This follows the guidelines for the right for effective treatment for individuals in schools. Additionally, this aligns with the ethical compliance codes.
To wrap up the ethical compliance code topic on our side, we just want to reiterate that the compliance code that would be in question with the BCBAs in place as the pro side wants is 5.0.
We have heard exceptional arguments from both sides with evidence from current literature and research to support their claims as to why ABA should or should not be mandated in schools. We as a group have decided that after listening to all arguments, ABA services should be a viable option for parents with children in faith. Thank you for listening to our debate. Now we turn to the audience for questions. First question, by choosing ABA, we are potentially removing focus from other important services. So why is ABA so important?
One aspect that you can look at from that why ABA is so important is that this intervention is focused on implementing evidence-based practices. Therefore, these interventions have been proven effective in the past. And also, when ABA is implemented, it is data-driven. So BCBAs take data on the behavior to see if there's a change. And if there is not a change in behavior, then interventions are modified to see if the behavior does change. So although there are other interventions that can be utilized and services, it is important that ABA be utilized because it has shown effective in the past.
Thank you. Second question, what are other strategies and methods are there instead of ABA?
One strategy that could be used instead of ABA would be training paraprofessionals instead of hiring BCBAs. Paraprofessionals are amazing in schools and provide so much service already. So they are there, they're in this school, they've been through the security and all that stuff within schools. So informing them and educating them on other interventions that could be used would be ideal. Specific established interventions that could be used are modeling, natural teaching strategies, pivotal response training, the use of schedules, and story-based interventions, as Colleen stated prior in the debate. We also highlighted on our side that positive behavior supports would be beneficial rather than ABA. And finding alternatives to ABA, specifically in this debate, we highlighted the Sunrise program, and finding other programs like that that would be providing services for children, but not necessarily going along the lines of ABA.
Thank you, Erin. And the last question, why is there so much training involved for our school personnel?
There's so much training because in order to make ABA an evidence-based practice, we need to ensure that everybody knows what they're doing. Without knowing what they're doing, things could potentially go very wrong by having untrained professionals dealing with large behaviors inappropriately.
And also for this aspect, it is important that behavior analysts are trained so that they are competent behavior analysts, so they can implement interventions that change behaviors through implementing evidence-based practices.
Thank you, Lauren and Kristen. And that wraps up our debate. Thank you guys for listening.